Camp Pendleton, California, August 2024. The kind of heat that turns asphalt into mirrors and makes grown men question their life choices. 104 degrees by noon, and the temperature was still climbing. I wasn't looking for a fight that day. After 4 combat tours, 12 years in the Marine Corps, and more close calls than I cared to remember, I'd learned that fights had a way of finding you whether you wanted them or not. But this particular fight, this one I'd been waiting 8 years to have. My name is Captain Kate Sullivan. Before that day, most people at Camp Pendleton knew me as a name on transfer orders, a file that crossed desks and got filed away. After that day, everyone would know exactly who I was. They'd know what I'd done, and they'd know what had been done to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how it started. The Dust Devils were spinning across Echo Company's training grounds when I arrived at 07:15, 15 minutes early, because punctuality is a religion in the Corps. The Marines were already forming up around the hand-to-hand combat demonstration area, 53 of them in utilities already dark with sweat stains. The sun hadn't even hit its stride yet, and these kids looked like they'd been through a car wash. I wore standard Marine Corps utility uniform, my dark blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun so tight it made my temples ache. At 5'8" and 145 pounds, I've got the build of a distance runner, not the kind of heavy muscle most people associate with combat effectiveness. That's always been my advantage. People underestimate what they can't categorize. I was walking the perimeter of the training area, familiarizing myself with the layout before officially reporting to the commanding officer when the voice cut through the morning heat like a blade through silk. "You there, female Marine?" I turned slowly. Economy of motion, that's what they teach you in Force Recon. Never waste energy on unnecessary movement. Colonel Marcus Brennan stood 30 yards away, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the demonstration mat. At 52, he retained the rigid posture of a man who'd spent 3 decades in uniform, though anyone who'd read his file knew his service had been notably light on actual combat deployments. His face, weathered more by administrative stress than battlefield exposure, held an expression I'd seen 1,000 times before: irritated authority, the look of a man who believed his rank entitled him to immediate compliance. "This is a restricted training area," he said, gesturing sharply in my direction. "Echo Company only. You need to clear out immediately." I could have identified myself right then, could have produced my orders, resolved the confusion in seconds. But something in Brennan's tone, the casual dismissiveness with which he'd addressed me, told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to play. So I decided to wait, to observe, to let the moment unfold naturally. Sometimes the best way to expose a man's character is to weave him enough rope. "Did you hear me, Marine?" His voice rose slightly, irritation growing. "I asked you a question. What company are you with?" "Sir, I began, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. "I don't want excuses. I want you off this training ground. Now." Staff Sergeant Jacob Wilson stood nearby with a clipboard, looking uncomfortable. He'd been briefed about the new combat instructor arriving today. Something about this woman's bearing probably suggested to him that I might be exactly that person. But questioning a commander in front of recruits wasn't an option. Not in the Marine Corps. "Ma'am," Wilson said, carefully approaching, "could I see your identification?" Before I could respond, one of the recruits in formation shifted his weight and accidentally dropped his canteen. The metallic clatter drew Brennan's attention like a predator focusing on movement. "Marine, pick that up and assume the push-up position," Brennan barked. "That's what happens when you can't maintain basic discipline." As the private scrambled to comply, Brennan turned back to me with renewed irritation. "This is exactly the problem," he said, moving closer. "Distractions during critical training. We're trying to prepare these Marines for combat, real combat, not whatever soft skills or administrative processing brought you to this base." The assembled recruits shifted uncomfortably. Several had noticed that I wasn't showing any of the typical signs of a Marine being dressed down by a senior officer. No nervous fidgeting, no hurried explanations, no visible anxiety. I simply stood there, present and attentive, as if Brennan's words were water flowing around a stone. I grew up on Marine Corps stories. My old man, Sergeant Major David Sullivan, served 2 tours in Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. He told me the Corps was built on three things: honor, courage, and brotherhood. By 2024, I'd learned the hard way that brotherhood didn't always include sisters. But my father had taught me something else too. He'd taught me patience. The kind of patience that lets you wait for exactly the right moment to act. And I could feel that moment approaching like storm clouds on a desert horizon. In fact, Brennan continued, his voice carrying across the formation. Since you're so eager to be part of this training, why don't you participate? Let's show these recruits what happens when someone unprepared enters a combat situation. He turned to Private Jackson, a kid barely 6 months past basic training, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Private Jackson front and center. The young Marine jogged to the mat with the nervous energy of someone who knows they're about to be used as an example, but doesn't understand for what purpose. Private, I want you to demonstrate a basic takedown on this Marine, Brennan said, gesturing to me. Show her what real combat training looks like. Jackson glanced at me, then back at Brennan, uncertainty clear on his face. Sir, the training protocol says. Are you questioning my order, Private? No, sir. Then execute. I stepped onto the mat without hesitation. The kid weighed maybe 185. I'd handled insurgents twice his size in Fallujah. This was basic physics. Jackson approached hesitantly and attempted a clumsy takedown. I sidestepped with minimal effort, using a subtle hip rotation that left him grasping air while I remained perfectly balanced. It was like dancing with someone who'd never heard music before. Again, Private, Brennan snapped, and this time make it count. Don't let her dance away. Jackson tried twice more. Each attempt ended with him off balance while I remained in complete control. I never struck back, never did anything that could be construed as aggressive. I was simply not where his momentum expected me to be. Pathetic, Brennan spat. The word hung in the superheated air. Is this what we're teaching Marines now? How to avoid confrontation. He scanned the demonstration area and his eyes landed on Gunnery Sergeant Dylan Porter. 6'4", 235 pounds of solid muscle with 3 Afghanistan tours under his belt. Porter was one of the best combat instructors on the base, and everyone knew it. Gunny, get on that mat, Brennan ordered. Let's show these recruits what real combat intensity looks like. I watched Porter's face, saw the moment of calculation. He'd caught something in the way I moved, the quality of my stillness. His professional instincts were telling him this was wrong, but his position in the chain of command required compliance. That's the thing about military hierarchy. It works beautifully right up until it doesn't. Right up until the moment someone abuses their authority so flagrantly that the whole system reveals its fault lines. Porter stepped onto the mat reluctantly. Sir, he said carefully, are we conducting a full contact demonstration? That's exactly what we're doing, Brennan confirmed, and there was something almost theatrical in his voice now. Something that suggested he was enjoying this. I want these recruits to understand that combat doesn't care about your gender or your feelings. It cares about capability. The irony of his statement hung in the air, unrecognized by the man who'd spoken it. Porter was good. I'd read his file. 2 combat action ribbons, martial arts instructor, certified, a reputation for technical precision that bordered on artistic. But I trained with the best. Master Gunnery Sergeant James Hawkins, 30 years in Force Recon, a man who'd forgotten more about close quarters combat than most instructors would ever learn. Reaper Hawkins had taught me something Brennan would never understand. Size is an advantage until it becomes a weakness. Strength is powerful until it's redirected. Mass is intimidating until someone who understands leverage decides to use it against you. Porter moved into position, and I could see him preparing what he hoped would be a controlled demonstration. Something that wouldn't actually injure me, regardless of what the commander had ordered. He was a good Marine trying to navigate an impossible situation. Gunny, Brennan said, his voice taking on an edge that made several of the watching Marines stiffen. I want you to strike her down, full contact. Show these Marines what happens to someone who isn't prepared. The words hung in the desert air like a verdict awaiting execution. 3 seconds. That's how long it took to change everything. Porter feinted with his left hand, a testing jab meant to gauge my reactions. My head moved 3 inches to the right. Minimal adjustment, maximum efficiency. He followed with his right, a controlled strike that carried enough force to be realistic, but not enough to cause serious injury if it landed. It never landed. Half a second. I intercepted his wrist with my left hand, not blocking, but redirecting, using his momentum. Guiding rather than opposing. 1.2 seconds. My right hand came up in a tight arc, open palm, striking the inside of his elbow. Not hard, just precisely. Hyperextending the joint just enough to compromise his structure. 2.1 seconds. I pivoted on my back foot, hip rotation, generating torque. Porter's weight shifted forward involuntarily as his arm lost its functional integrity. 2.8 seconds. My hand slid from his wrist to his shoulder, adding firm downward pressure that accelerated his descent. 3.0 seconds. 235 pounds of Marine hit the mat with a sound that echoed across the training ground. Before he could even process what had happened, I'd transitioned to a control position. Knee on spine, hands securing his arm in a configuration that would require maybe 2 pounds of pressure to dislocate his shoulder if I chose to apply it. Porter tapped the mat twice. Universal signal of submission. I released him immediately and offered him my hand. He took it, rising to his feet with a stunned expression that slowly transformed into something like professional respect. "Outstanding technique, ma'am," he said quietly. "Where did you train?" Before I could respond, Brennan's voice cut across the space, sharp with disbelief and something approaching panic. "No, that's not Gunny. What the hell just happened?" Porter turned to face the commander, and there was something in his expression now, a kind of dawning realization. "Sir, I was taken down by someone who clearly has extensive combat training. That was the cleanest reversal I've experienced outside of—" He paused, and I watched the pieces clicking into place. "Sir, do you know who this is?" Brennan's face had gone pale, then flushed red. I could see his world, built on certain assumptions about capability and hierarchy, experiencing a seismic disruption. That's when Sergeant Major William MacArthur stepped out from the shadow of a Humvee parked near the administrative building. Mac was 58 years old and looked like a piece of living history. Gulf War veteran, Somalia, Iraqi freedom, 41 years of service that showed in every line of his weathered face and every deliberate movement. The kind of Marine that other Marines instinctively straightened up around regardless of rank. He walked across the hot asphalt toward the demonstration mat carrying a tablet, his face revealing nothing. When he reached the mat's edge, he stopped and looked first at me, then at Porter, and finally at Brennan. "Commander," Mac said, his voice carrying that low, measured tone of absolute certainty that comes from 4 decades of knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. "I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding." Brennan straightened, attempting to reassert his authority. "Sergeant Major, this Marine violated restricted training area protocols. I was simply—" "Sir." The single word carried enough weight to stop Brennan mid-sentence. "I'd like to introduce you to Captain Kate Sullivan." The effect of the rank was immediate. Across the formation, eyes widened. Wilson, who'd been about to ask for my identification, went rigid. Porter snapped to attention instinctively, but Mac wasn't finished. "Captain Sullivan transferred to Camp Pendleton 3 days ago with orders to establish and command the new Advanced Close Quarters Combat Program for Female Marine Integration. She reports directly to this command." He paused, his eyes never leaving Brennan's face, and I saw something flicker there. Something old and patient and very, very deliberate. "Her orders were on your desk for signature yesterday morning, sir." I watched Brennan's face cycle through several shades of red and white. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without producing sound. Mac continued, his voice taking on a quality that suggested he was reading from official documentation, though his eyes never looked at the tablet. "Captain Sullivan's service record includes 4 combat deployments with force reconnaissance units in Al Anbar province. She holds the Silver Star for actions in Ramadi in 2016 when she single-handedly provided sniper overwatch for a 6-hour engagement, eliminated 11 insurgents, and enabled the extraction of 6 wounded Marines after the ground commander ordered a premature withdrawal. The silence on the training ground was now absolute, profound, crushing. She also holds 2 Bronze Stars with V, Devices for Valor in Fallujah and Mosul, a Purple Heart, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, with Combat V, and the Combat Action Ribbon with 3 stars, indicating 4 separate combat engagements. Mac's weathered face showed the faintest hint of something that might have been satisfaction. Her specialization is urban warfare and close quarters combat tactics. She has personally trained over 200 Marines in advanced fighting techniques and has a perfect safety record. Her operational history includes classified missions I'm not at liberty to discuss, but I can tell you that she has received written commendations from 3 different Marine Expeditionary Force commanders, 2 JSOC task force leaders, and 1 4-star general who specifically requested her assignment to his protection detail during a high-threat environment deployment. Brennan stood frozen. I could see it happening in real time, the architecture of his reality crumbling around him. He hadn't just made a mistake, he'd publicly humiliated himself by attacking the professional credibility of someone whose combat record eclipsed his own by several orders of magnitude. Mac turned to me, and in a gesture that sent shockwaves through the entire command structure present, he came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. Captain Sullivan, on behalf of Echo Company and the Training Command, welcome to Camp Pendleton. We're honored to have an operator of your caliber joining our team. I returned the salute with equal precision, my expression revealing nothing. Thank you, Sergeant Major. I look forward to working with the company. The formation of Marines remained at attention, but a palpable shift had occurred in their collective awareness. They just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the physical demonstration of skill, but the public correction of assumptions that many of them had unconsciously carried. Corporal Emma Blake, standing in the second row of the formation, felt something like electricity running through her body. She'd joined the Marines despite her father's objections that women didn't belong in combat roles. She'd endured countless small dismissals, casual skepticism about female capabilities. And she'd just watched a woman who weighed less than 150 take down the company's largest instructor in 3 seconds flat. Commander Mack said, his voice carefully neutral, "Would you like to address the company?" Brennan stood paralyzed by the magnitude of his error. Every word he'd spoken in the last 20 minutes now hung in the air as evidence of his prejudice and incompetence. He'd created a situation that would be discussed in every ready room and NCO club on the base within hours. He began, then stopped. His command authority, so confidently wielded moments ago, now felt like ash in his mouth. "I need to review some administrative matters. Sergeant Major, please conduct the remainder of this training period." He turned and walked away from the mat, his stride attempting dignity, but achieving only retreat. Mac watched him go, then turned to address the company. "All right, Marines, what you just witnessed was a demonstration of the principle that combat effectiveness comes from training experience and mindset, not from assumptions about size or gender." Captain Sullivan's technique was textbook perfect. She used leverage timing and precision to neutralize a larger opponent's strength advantage. For the next 40 minutes, Porter and I walked the recruits through the principles of efficient force application. I spoke little, allowing Porter to provide most of the verbal instruction while I demonstrated the movements with crystalline precision. Emma Blake watched with intense focus, memorizing every detail. This was what she'd joined for. This was what she'd believed was possible, even when everyone around her suggested otherwise. When the training block concluded, Mac called the company to attention. "Captain Sullivan will be establishing her office in Building 1133. Her program officially launches in 2 weeks. Any Marine interested in advanced combat training should submit requests through their chain of command." He paused, his eyes scanning the formation. "And let me be very clear. Captain Sullivan earned her position through combat performance and professional excellence. She is not here as part of some political initiative or social experiment. She's here because she's the best person for this job. Understood?" "Yes, Sergeant Major," the company responded in unison. Dismissed. The formation broke, Marines clustering in small groups to discuss what they just witnessed. I collected my cover and began walking toward Building 1133, where my new office waited. Porter jogged to catch up with me. "Ma'am, I just wanted to apologize for buying..." "You followed orders, Gunny," I said, cutting him off gently. "Nothing to apologize for." "Still, I should have recognized, I mean the way you moved, I should have realized you were..." "You did realize," I said, stopping to face him. "I saw it in your eyes, but you were in an impossible position. You handled it as well as anyone could have." Porter studied my face, searching for any sign of resentment or anger. He found none. "Ma'am, that reversal you used, was that Krav Maga or..." "It's a blend," Jiu-Jitsu foundations with some Krav Maga modifications and techniques I picked up from force recon training. The key is economy of motion, never using more force than necessary. Would you be willing to teach some of those techniques to the combat instructors? We could integrate them into the standard curriculum. That's exactly what I'm here to do, Gunny. We continued walking together, falling into the natural conversation of professionals discussing their craft. Behind us, Mac watched from his position near the Humvee, satisfied that this particular crisis had resolved as well as could be expected. But he knew the real challenges were just beginning. Commander Brennan wasn't the type of man who accepted humiliation gracefully, and his influence within the base command structure was substantial. What had happened on the training ground today would have repercussions that extended far beyond a single afternoon's embarrassment. In his office in Building 1133, Brennan sat at his desk, staring at the personnel file that had been sitting in his signature folder since yesterday. Captain Kate Sullivan's official photo looked back at him, professional and composed. He'd never opened the file, had never bothered to read the orders, had simply assumed that any female captain transferring to his training command would be assigned to some administrative role that he could safely ignore. Now he opened it, and as he read, something cold settled in his stomach. Ramadi, June 2016, Operation Phantom Thunder. He remembered that operation. He'd been the ground commander. It had been his first real combat deployment, and it had gone catastrophically wrong. 3 Marines died. 6 more were wounded. The after-action report he'd written had carefully documented the events in ways that protected his career and explained the casualties as unavoidable consequences of faulty intelligence. But Lieutenant Sullivan's name in that report had been mentioned only once. A single line about sniper overwatch before evacuation with the main element. Brennan's hands began to shake as memories he'd spent 8 years burying fought their way to the surface. The panic in his voice as he ordered the withdrawal. The shame he'd felt abandoning wounded Marines. The lies he'd told himself and others to justify decisions made in fear. His phone buzzed, a text message from his executive officer. "Sir, the Echo Company incident is already circulating. Do you want me to attempt damage control?" Brennan stared at the message for a long moment before typing his response. "No. Schedule a meeting with Captain Sullivan for 0800 tomorrow. I need to address this directly." What he couldn't know in that moment, was that addressing it directly would open doors to truths he'd spent years trying to keep sealed. Because Kate Sullivan's arrival at Camp Pendleton wasn't just about establishing a new training program. It was about accountability for a mission that had gone wrong 8 years earlier. A mission where decisions made by then Major Brennan had cost Marines their lives, and where the only person who'd stayed behind to save them had been a young lieutenant whose contributions had been systematically erased from all official documentation, a lieutenant named Kate Sullivan. That evening in my sparsely furnished quarters in Sector 7, I sat at a small desk reviewing the curriculum framework for my new program. The single lamp cast a pool of yellow light across documents outlining training protocols, equipment requirements, projected timelines. My phone buzzed, a text from Mac. "Meeting with Brennan at 0800. He'll apologize. Accept graciously, but establish boundaries. This isn't over." I typed back a single word. "Understood." Mac was right. Men like Brennan didn't simply accept professional humiliation. They rationalized it, repositioned it, found ways to reassert control. Tomorrow's meeting would be theater, a performance of contrition designed to limit damage rather than acknowledge genuine error. But what concerned me more was the memory that had surfaced during today's confrontation. A memory I'd successfully buried for 8 years. Brennan's face younger than shouting orders through radio static, the smell of burning vehicles, the weight of Corporal Peterson's body as I dragged him through rubble, and the terrible sound of Lieutenant Eric MacArthur's voice going silent mid-transmission. I pushed the memory down again, forcing my attention back to the present. The curriculum wouldn't write itself, and dwelling on the past served no operational purpose. But even as I returned to my work, I knew that the past was no longer safely contained. Brennan had recognized my name when Mac had spoken it. I was certain. The brief flash in his eyes, quickly suppressed, had told me everything. The question now was what he would do with that recognition. My phone rang. My father, David Sullivan, retired Sergeant Major, 60 years old and still carrying himself like he was ready to deploy at a moment's notice. "Katie girl," he said, his voice warm with that particular blend of pride and concern that only fathers seem to master. "I heard what happened. You okay?" "I'm fine, Dad, but it's going to get ugly." "Uglier than Ramadi." I smiled despite myself. "Different kind of fight. This one's against our own." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that suggested my father was choosing his words carefully. "Then fight like a Sullivan," he said finally. "We don't quit." "I know, Dad." Another pause, longer this time. "Katie, I need to tell you something about that Ramadi report. I was one of the senior enlisted advisors who signed off on it. I should have questioned the discrepancies, should have pushed back on Brennan's narrative, but I didn't. I trusted the officer's account over my own instincts. That was my failure." I closed my eyes. I'd known, of course, known for 8 years that my father's signature was on that document, but hearing him acknowledge it still hit like a physical blow. "Dad, no, let me finish. What you're about to do, exposing what really happened, it's going to implicate people. Good Marines who made bad decisions. Marines like me. And I want you to know that I support you. Whatever comes out, whatever consequences fall on me or anyone else, you tell the truth. The whole truth. The Corps needs it, even if the Corps doesn't want it." My throat tightened. "Thank you," I managed. "Don't thank me. Just promise me you'll see this through. Promise me you won't let them bury it again." "I promise." After we hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time thinking about promises and truth and the cost of keeping both. Finally, I opened my laptop and pulled up a folder I'd kept hidden for 8 years. A folder labeled simply Ramadi. Inside were 6 hours of helmet cam footage, time-stamped, GPS tagged, unedited. 6 hours of truth that could end careers, destroy reputations, and force the Marine Corps to confront uncomfortable questions about honor and integrity and what those words actually meant. My finger hovered over the delete button. It would be so easy. Delete the evidence. Accept Brennan's apology tomorrow. Take the position I had earned and move forward. Let the past stay buried. But then I thought about Eric MacArthur, 24 years old, bleeding out in my arms, using his last conscious moments to tell me that I was the real deal, making me promise to tell his father the truth. I thought about the 6 Marines I'd pulled from that building one by one while Brennan cowered 2 clicks away, about the hours spent holding pressure on wounds that were beyond saving, about the radio calls requesting extraction that went unanswered because the ground commander had declared the position too hot. I thought about the 8 years I'd spent watching my contributions erase my achievements, minimize my service, documented as merely adequate. And I thought about all the women who'd come after me, the ones who'd faced the same dismissals, the same casual prejudice, the same systematic burial of their accomplishments, unless someone forced the system to change. My finger moved away from the delete button. Instead, I created a backup, then another backup. Then I encrypted the files and sent copies to 3 different secure locations. An email notification popped up on my screen. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Hayes, JAG office. Captain Sullivan, your sworn testimony required 0800 tomorrow. Bring any supporting evidence. Investigation expanding to include historical documentation of Operation Phantom Thunder. Hayes, I looked at the helmet cam files on my screen. 6 hours of evidence that could change everything or destroy everything depending on your perspective. Another email arrived. This one from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line. Just a single sentence. Don't push this. You'll destroy good Marines' careers. Some secrets should stay buried. I stared at that email for a long time. Whoever sent it wasn't entirely wrong. What I was about to do would destroy careers. Good Marines, many of them who'd made decisions based on a flawed systems, flawed assumptions. Men who'd served honorably in most respects, but had failed the test when it came to recognizing capability that didn't match their preconceptions. Men like my father. I typed a response but didn't send it. Eric's secret stayed buried for 8 years, not anymore. Instead, I closed the laptop and moved to the window overlooking the training grounds. They were empty now, quiet under the California stars. Tomorrow they'd be filled again with Marines training for a war that might never come, or might come tomorrow, or might already be here in ways they didn't recognize. In the Marines, they teach you that loyalty is everything. Loyalty to your brothers, loyalty to your unit, loyalty to the core. But what they don't teach you is what to do when those loyalties collide. When telling the truth means betraying the men you served with. When honor requires dishonoring those who came before you. When the only way to protect the institution is to wound it so deeply that it has no choice but to change. What they don't teach you is that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought against enemies with guns and explosives. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought against allies who don't want to hear the truth, against systems that protect themselves by protecting the guilty, against comfortable lies that feel like loyalty but are really just cowardice in dress blues. I stood at that window for hours watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, thinking about the choice I'd already made but hadn't yet fully accepted. By the time the sun began to lighten the eastern sky, I'd made peace with what was coming. Not peace in the sense of comfort or certainty, but peace in the sense of knowing that some things mattered more than personal comfort or institutional loyalty. Things like truth and honor. And making sure that when a Marine dies protecting his brothers, his sacrifice is documented honestly, not buried under convenient lies told by men who were too afraid to do their jobs. At 07:30, I received one final email before heading to the JAG office. It was from Mac. No words, just an attachment. I opened it. It was his confidential memo from 2016, the one he'd submitted through official channels reporting discrepancies in Brennan's after-action report, the one that had somehow been lost before it reached higher command, the one that Mac had apparently kept a copy of, waiting for the right moment to resurrect it. The memo detailed everything, my actions during those 6 hours, the Marines I'd saved, the insurgents I'd eliminated, the defensive position I'd held alone, all documented with the precision of a senior enlisted advisor who'd spent 40 years learning how to cover his ass with paperwork. At the bottom of the memo, Mac had added a handwritten note. Kate, I've carried this for 8 years waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Looks like that someone is you. Give them hell. Mac. I saved the file, added it to my encrypted backup folder, and headed to building 1133. The morning air was already hot, promising another day of temperatures that would test the limits of human endurance. But I'd been tested by worse than heat. Much worse. As I walked across the empty training ground, where yesterday's confrontation had taken place, I thought about Eric MacArthur one more time. Thought about his final words. Thought about the promise I'd made to him. Don't let them erase you. I hadn't let them erase me, not entirely, but I'd let them minimize me. Let them reduce 6 hours of sustained combat to a single line in a report. Let them bury the truth because speaking it would have been career suicide for a junior officer with everything to lose. But I wasn't a junior officer anymore. And I'd learned something in 8 years that the Corps had never intended to teach me. Sometimes the only way to honor the uniform is to dishonor the people who've betrayed what it stands for. The JAG office was in Building 1133, third floor corner office with a view of the training grounds. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Hayes was waiting for me, along with Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Graham from the Inspector General's office. And sitting across from them, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight, was Colonel Marcus Brennan. This was it, the moment where 8 years of buried truth would finally surface, where comfortable lies would collide with uncomfortable facts, where the Marine Corps would have to decide whether it cared more about protecting its image or honoring its values. I walked into that office carrying a USB drive with 6 hours of helmet cam footage and Mac's memo documenting everything Brennan had buried. I walked into that office knowing I might be ending my career, knowing I might be destroying good Marines who'd made bad decisions, knowing I might be forcing my own father to face consequences for failures of oversight. But I also walked into that office knowing something else. Some truths are too important to stay buried. Some promises are too sacred to break. And some fights are worth having, even when you know they'll cost you everything. Colonel Brennan looked up as I entered. Our eyes met. And in that moment, I saw him realize that I knew everything, knew about Ramadi, knew about the LAN, knew about the 8 years of cover-up. His face went pale. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes gestured to the chair across from Brennan. Chief Warrant Officer Graham was already there, tablet ready to document everything. This was it, the moment 8 years of buried truth would finally surface. I placed the USB drive on the conference table between us. Hayes looked at the drive, then at me, then at Brennan. Gentlemen, she said quietly, I believe we're about to rewrite history. I reached for the USB drive, and the reckoning began. The USB drive sat on the conference table like a live grenade. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Hayes picked it up, turned it over in her hands, then looked at me with the kind of expression that comes from 21 years of military law experience. The expression that says she's seen evidence break careers before, but something about this felt different. Before we proceed, Hayes said, I need to establish the chain of custody for whatever's on this drive. Captain Sullivan, where did this evidence originate, and who else has had access to it? The footage is from my personal helmet camera during Operation Phantom Thunder Ramadi, June 12, 2016. I recorded it. I maintained custody of it. No one else has viewed the complete footage except me, until now. Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Graham, the Inspector General Investigator, pulled out a form and began documenting my statement. He was 45 with the careful movements of a man who'd spent his career investigating things people wanted to stay hidden. Captain, why did you wait 8 years to come forward with this evidence? Graham's voice was neutral, but the question carried weight. I'd anticipated this, had prepared my answer during the sleepless hours before dawn. Because I was a lieutenant who'd learned that challenging field-grade officers ends careers. Because I loved the Marine Corps and believed it would correct itself, I was wrong on both counts. Colonel Brennan sat motionless, staring at the table. His attorney, Captain Ryan Foster, leaned over and whispered something urgently. Brennan shook his head once sharply. The first 15 minutes showed routine overwatch. My rifle, an M40A6, positioned on its bipod, the compound visible in the distance. Radio chatter between team elements as they prepared for entry. Then Brennan's voice, younger and uncertain, calling for breach. The ambush hit at minute 15. Even on the small laptop screen, even 8 years later, the violence was immediate and shocking. The RPG strike that killed Corporal Hayes before he'd made it past the threshold. The automatic weapons fire that pinned Brennan's element on the second floor. The screams of wounded Marines that carried across 200 meters of urban wasteland. I watched Brennan's face as he watched his younger self make the decision that would define the rest of his career. The decision to withdraw, to abandon 6 wounded Marines because the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond his ability to manage it. At minute 23, my helmet cam captured his voice on the radio. All elements withdraw. Repeat, full withdrawal. Fall back to Rally Point Bravo. Then Lieutenant Eric MacArthur's voice, strained but controlled. 6 wounded still inside. Request permission to hold position until medevac arrives. Brennan's response was immediate. Negative. Fall back now. That's an order. On the screen, my rifle tracked movement in a third-story window. An insurgent with an RPG. The crosshairs settled. My breathing slowed. The trigger press was smooth and inevitable. The insurgent dropped. At minute 30, my voice came through the audio for the first time. Overwatch has 6 wounded visual. I'm staying. There was a long pause on the radio, then Brennan's voice, sharp with something that might have been fear or anger or both. Lieutenant Sullivan, you are ordered to fall back with the main element. My response was simple. Understood, sir, but I'm staying. What followed was the longest 6 hours of my life compressed into digital footage that couldn't fully capture the heat, the fear, the desperate mathematics of ammunition, conservation, and target prioritization. Hayes fast-forwarded through sections, but I called out the timestamps that mattered. Minute 35. First insurgent eliminated. 412 meters headshot through a window. Minute 52. Position compromised by counter-sniper fire. I relocated, took shrapnel to the left shoulder, kept shooting. Hour 1:14 minutes. 5 insurgents eliminated in rapid succession as they tried to flank the wounded Marines' position. Hour 2:14 minutes. I moved down from the rooftop to ground level. The helmet cam showed me dragging Eric MacArthur across open ground while rounds sparked off concrete around us. His leg was destroyed below the knee, 2 rounds in his chest. He was conscious barely and trying to tell me to leave him. I'd forgotten that part, or maybe I just refused to remember it. Hayes played that section at normal speed. Everyone in the room watched Eric MacArthur, 24 years old and dying, use what might have been his last words to order me to save myself. Leave me, Lieutenant. That's an order. My voice on the recording was steady despite the exertion, despite the incoming fire, despite everything. With respect, sir, fuck your order. Under different circumstances, that might have been funny. Insubordination in the face of certain death preserved for posterity on government-issued recording equipment. But nobody in that conference room was laughing. Hour 4:33 minutes. The footage showed me with a boot knife and compression bandage performing field surgery on Eric's chest wounds. My hands were covered in blood. Eric's face was gray. But he was talking, and that meant he was alive. The satellite phone call came at hour 4:41 minutes. I'd used my personal sat phone to patch Eric through to his wife, Sarah, 8 months pregnant with their first child. Hayes played that section with the volume turned up. Eric's voice was weak but clear. "Sarah, baby, I need you to listen. I'm hit pretty bad. I don't think I'm making it out of this one." Sarah's voice came through distant and breaking. "No, Eric, don't say that. The medevac is coming. You're going to be fine." "Maybe, but if I'm not, I need you to know something. You and the baby are everything to me. Everything good I ever did. Every reason I had to be better than I was, that was all for you." There was a pause, and then Eric said something that made my chest tighten even 8 years later. "And Sarah, there's a Marine here with me, Lieutenant Sullivan. She stayed when everyone else left. She's been keeping me alive for 4 hours. If I die, I want you to know it's because the wound was too bad, not because she didn't try hard enough. This woman is the real deal. Tell my dad that. Tell him Kate Sullivan is the real deal." The recording captured Sarah's sobbing, Eric's labored breathing, and the distant crack of rifle fire. As I eliminated another insurgent who'd gotten too close to our position, Eric died at hour 5:53 minutes. 19 minutes before the quick reaction force finally arrived. The last section of footage showed me exhausted and bloodied, having secured all 6 wounded Marines in a defendable position. 5 of them would survive. Eric wouldn't. But they were all accounted for when the QRF rolled in with Colonel Brennan, who'd spent the last 6 hours organizing the rescue from a safe distance. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Hayes closed the laptop slowly, deliberately, as if the machine itself might shatter from what it had just displayed. Graham spoke first. "Captain Sullivan, this footage directly contradicts the official after-action report filed by then-Major Brennan. That report states, and I'm reading from the archived file, all wounded personnel were secured by the quick reaction force under my tactical command. Sniper provided adequate overwatch before evacuating with the main element." He looked up at Brennan. "Colonel, how do you explain this discrepancy?" Brennan's face had gone through several color changes during the video playback. Now it settled on a kind of gray that reminded me of Eric's face in those final minutes, the color of someone confronting their own mortality. His attorney leaned in again, whispering urgently. Brennan shook his head. "I'd like to make a statement," Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Foster tried to object, but Brennan held up a hand. "No, Ryan, I'm done hiding." He looked at me for the first time since the video had started playing. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from lack of sleep or suppressed tears, I couldn't tell. "I was scared," he said simply. "It was my first real combat deployment. I'd spent 20 years preparing for that moment, and when it came, I panicked. I ordered the withdrawal because I couldn't handle the situation. Because I was terrified. Because I failed." His hands were flat on the table now, pressing down as if he needed something solid to anchor himself. "When we got back to base, I couldn't admit that. Couldn't admit that a lieutenant, a woman with less than 4 years in service, had done what I was too afraid to do. So I rewrote the narrative. I made myself the hero and buried her contributions. And when Sergeant Major MacArthur challenged me, when he submitted a memo documenting what actually happened, I used my rank to make that memo disappear." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Graham pulled up another file on his tablet. "Speaking of that memo," he said, "we recovered it from archive servers 3 days ago. Captain Sullivan, did you provide us with a copy as well?" I nodded and pulled out a printed version of Mac's confidential report from 2016. 8 pages of detailed documentation that corroborated everything the helmet cam footage showed. Hayes read through it quickly, her expression growing darker with each page. This memo was submitted through official channels and should have triggered a formal investigation. Instead, it was classified as resolved administratively and archived without action. "Colonel Brennan, did you have anything to do with that classification?" "Yes." The word came out like a death sentence. "I convinced the reviewing officer that MacArthur was mistaken, that his son's death had clouded his judgment, that the official report was accurate. I lied, directly and repeatedly. Captain Foster had given up trying to control his client. He sat back in his chair with the expression of a man watching a career immolation he was powerless to stop. Graham leaned forward. Colonel, we've been investigating the broader command climate issues at this installation. During that investigation, we've identified patterns of evaluation disparities affecting female Marines under your command. Are you aware of these patterns? Brennan's laugh was bitter broken. Wary of them, I helped create them. The room went very still. After Ramadi, I was mentored by senior officers who taught me how to manage the female integration issue. They showed me how to write fitness reports that appeared objective, but systematically rated women lower than equivalent male peers. How to document after-action reports that minimize female contributions. How to create a paper trail that would justify slower promotion timelines and limited advancement opportunities. He looked at me again. Captain Sullivan's case wasn't unique. It was just the most egregious example. There were others, dozens of others across my career. All of them documented using the same techniques I'd learned from men who'd learned them from men before them. Hayes's voice was sharp. Give me names, Colonel. Every officer who participated in this network. Brennan pulled out his phone, accessed a notes file, and handed the device to Hayes. She scrolled through it, her expression growing increasingly grim. 17 names, she said quietly, including 3 general officers and 7 colonels currently serving at HQMC and other major commands. Graham was already on his secure phone, presumably calling the Inspector General of the Marine Corps. Before he could finish dialing, the conference room door opened. Rebecca Brennan stood in the doorway. I'd met the colonel's wife once briefly at a formal function 6 months earlier. She was 52, a nurse practitioner with 28 years of marriage to the Marine Corps. She carried herself with the kind of quiet competence that comes from managing military healthcare bureaucracy and military spousal expectations in equal measure. Now she looked like someone who'd spent the night making the hardest decision of her life. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. I have evidence that needs to be submitted to this investigation. She carried a briefcase which she set on the table. Ma'am, this is a closed legal proceeding, Captain Foster objected. You can't just... I'm a material witness with direct evidence of criminal conduct, Rebecca said calmly. I understand my rights and responsibilities under the UCMJ. I'm here voluntarily and I'm prepared to testify under oath. Brennan's face went from gray to white. Rebecca, you don't have to do this. She looked at her husband with an expression that held 28 years of complicated history. Yes, Marcus, I do. She opened the briefcase and removed a thick folder of documents. My husband kept files, personal files outside official records. 8 years of email strategy, documents, fitness report templates, all designed to systematically disadvantage female Marines while maintaining plausible deniability. 17 officers participated in this network, coordinating their efforts to preserve what they called traditional standards. She placed the folder in front of Hayes. I found these files last night. I spent the night reading them and understanding what my husband had been part of what he'd helped build. And I realized I had a choice. Protect him and become complicit, or protect the institution he'd betrayed. Her voice didn't waver, but I saw her hands shake slightly as she released the folder. My son is deployed with 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. He's due to rotate back next month. I don't want him serving in a Marine Corps that protects lies and punishes truth. I want him to serve in the Corps Captain Sullivan believes in. The one that actually honors its values instead of just printing them on recruiting posters. Brennan looked at his wife with something like despair. You understand what this means for us, for our family. I understand that our family is already broken, Marcus. It broke the day you chose your career over your integrity. I'm just making that break official. Hayes was already paging through the documents, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to barely controlled anger. These communications span 8 years and involve coordination at multiple command levels. This isn't unconscious bias or cultural lag. This is deliberate, systematic discrimination backed by detailed documentation and shared methodology. She looked up at Graham. Chief, this investigation just expanded from one installation to service-wide. We need the full IG team here within 24 hours. Graham nodded and stepped out to make calls. I sat quietly watching the architecture of an entire system begin to collapse under the weight of evidence that had been hidden for nearly a decade. This was what justice looked like when it finally arrived. Not clean or satisfying or triumphant, just necessary and painful and irreversible. Hayes turned to me. Captain Sullivan, we're going to need detailed testimony from you about every instance where you believe your performance was misrepresented or your advancement was hindered. We're also going to need you to review these documents and identify which incidents you have direct knowledge of. Understood, ma'am. One more thing. Your father, Sergeant Major David Sullivan, retired. His name appears in these files as one of several senior enlisted advisors who signed off on questionable reports without adequate verification. We'll need to interview him as well. The moment I'd been dreading. The moment when exposing the truth would catch my own father in its blast radius. He's already aware, ma'am. He told me last night to tell the whole truth regardless of consequences to him. Hayes nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across her face. That takes integrity. Make sure you tell him I said that when this is all over. The door opened again. This time it was the one person I'd been both hoping and dreading to see. Sergeant Major William MacArthur walked in, followed by a woman I recognized from photographs. Sarah MacArthur, Eric's widow. And beside her a boy about 8 years old who looked so much like his father that my chest tightened. Hayes stood. Sergeant Major Mrs. MacArthur, this is an active legal proceeding. I know what it is, Colonel Mack said, his voice carrying that tone that somehow conveyed respect and absolute authority simultaneously. Mrs. MacArthur has information relevant to this investigation. Information I believe you'll want to hear. Sarah MacArthur looked at me, her eyes red but dry. 8 years of grief and anger had apparently burned through all her tears. Captain Sullivan, she said, I've been following the investigation. When Sergeant Major MacArthur told me what was happening, I realized I had evidence too. Evidence my husband wanted me to keep safe. She placed a small object on the table, a digital recorder. Eric gave me this the day before he deployed. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to his father or to anyone investigating his death. I never had reason to before now. She pressed play. Eric's voice filled the room. Young, alive, full of the nervous energy that comes before deployment. Sarah, baby, I'm recording this just in case. You know how it is. We train for the worst and hope for the best, but sometimes the worst finds you anyway. There was a pause, rustling sounds. I want to talk about the team I'm deploying with, specifically about Lieutenant Kate Sullivan. I've been working with her for 6 months now, and I need you to understand something. She's the best combat Marine I've ever trained with. Better than most of the men. Better than me in a lot of ways. Another pause. I'm telling you this because if something happens on this deployment, there are going to be people who want to minimize what she contributes. There are going to be senior officers who can't accept that a woman can be that good. But I'm telling you now on record that Kate Sullivan is exactly who I want watching my back in a firefight. His voice dropped lower. And Sarah, if I don't make it back, and if something goes wrong, I need you to promise me you'll fight for the truth. Don't let them bury what really happened. Don't let them turn my death into a political talking point or a convenient narrative. The truth matters. Promise me. Sarah's voice on the recording, younger and uncertain. I promise, Eric. The recording ended. Sarah looked at Colonel Brennan with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite hatred, not quite pity, something in between. My husband died 8 years ago, she said. For 8 years, I believed the official story, that he died heroically during an evacuation led by his commanding officer, that his death was unfortunate but unavoidable. She gestured at the laptop with the helmet cam footage. Last night, Sergeant Major MacArthur showed me what actually happened. He showed me that Captain Sullivan stayed behind when you ran, that she kept my husband alive for 6 hours, that she gave him the chance to say goodbye to me, and that you spent 8 years lying about it. Her voice didn't rise, didn't break, but every word landed like a hammer. I want you to know that my son will grow up knowing the truth. He'll know that his father died with honor. He'll know that Captain Sullivan honored that death by refusing to let it be buried in lies. And he'll know that you dishonored both of them by choosing your career over their service. Brennan's face was wet now. Whether from tears or sweat in the over-air-conditioned room, I couldn't tell. Mrs. MacArthur, I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate. I know sorry doesn't bring Eric back or give you the 8 years of truth you deserved. But I am genuinely desperately sorry. Sarah nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them. Your apology is noted, Colonel. Now I want to watch you face consequences. Hayes cleared her throat. Mrs. MacArthur, thank you for this evidence. We'll need to take possession of that recording for the investigation. Of course, I've already made copies for myself and for Eric Jr. Whatever you need. Mac put his hand on Sarah's shoulder, and she reached up to cover it with her own. The gesture was simple, but spoke volumes about the 8 years they'd spent supporting each other through grief that should never have been complicated by lies. Graham returned from his phone calls. Ma'am, the IG is mobilizing a full investigation team. They'll be here by 1800 hours. I've also received authorization to expand the investigation to all Marine Corps commands. This is going to be the largest internal review in decades. Hayes nodded grimly. Good, because based on what we've seen today, this isn't a few bad actors. This is systemic corruption that reaches to the highest levels of command. She turned to Brennan. Colonel, you're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. You're confined to quarters pending formal charges. Chief Warrant Officer Graham will coordinate with your attorney regarding the specific articles you'll be charged under, but I can tell you now to expect Article 107 for false official statements, Article 133 for conduct unbecoming, and we'll be reviewing whether Article 92 applies for failure to obey regulations regarding equal opportunity. Brennan nodded numbly. I understand. You'll also be expected to provide complete testimony regarding every officer in this network. No more protecting anyone. Full cooperation or we add obstruction charges. Clear? Yes, ma'am. Captain Foster finally spoke up. My client will cooperate fully with the investigation. In exchange, we'd like to discuss potential sentencing considerations. You can discuss that with the convening authority after charges are filed. Hayes cut him off. Right now, your client needs to get out of my sight before I forget I'm supposed to maintain professional detachment. Brennan stood slowly, looking like he'd aged another 10 years in the last hour. He paused at the door and looked back at me. Captain Sullivan, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that watching that footage, seeing what you did, what I failed to do, it destroyed something in me. Not my career, something deeper. The lie I'd been telling myself for 8 years about who I was and what I'd done. He swallowed hard. You're everything the Marine Corps should be. I'm everything that's wrong with it. I'm glad one of us is still here to make it better. Then he was gone, escorted by 2 MPs who'd been waiting in the hallway. The room was silent for a long moment after he left. Finally, Max spoke. Colonel Hayes, Captain Sullivan, and there's one more thing you should know. General Raymond Wallace, the Commandant, is flying in tomorrow morning. He wants a full briefing on this investigation before it goes public. Hayes's eyebrows rose. The Commandant personally. He said, and I'm quoting, if we have systemic corruption at this level, I want to see the evidence with my own eyes before I brief the Secretary of the Navy. He'll be here at 0730. I felt something shift in my chest. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, the single highest ranking Marine, coming here to personally review evidence that could destroy dozens of careers and fundamentally reshape how the Corps handled integration. This had just become something much bigger than one colonel's lies or one captain's quest for justice. This had become an institutional reckoning. Hayes looked at me. Captain, I hope you understand what you've started here. This investigation is going to consume the next year of your life. You'll be testifying repeatedly. You'll be questioned by defense attorneys trying to discredit you. You'll be used as a political symbol by advocates and opponents of integration. Your privacy is gone. Your reputation will be attacked. Every decision you have ever made will be scrutinized. She paused. And despite all of that, I need to ask, are you prepared to see this through to the end? I thought about Eric MacArthur, about the 6 Marines I'd pulled from that building, about the 8 years of minimized contributions and buried truth, about all the women who'd come after me and would face the same systemic bias unless something fundamentally changed. Yes, ma'am, I'm prepared. Good, because we're going to need you to be stronger than you've ever been. This fight is just beginning. As the meeting broke up and people filed out of the conference room, Mac hung back. When we were alone, he fixed me with that weathered stare that had probably terrified generations of young Marines. You did good today, Kate. Eric would be proud. Hell, I'm proud. Thank you, Sergeant Major. But I need you to understand something. What's coming next is going to be harder than Ramadi. In combat, you know who the enemy is. They're the ones shooting at you. In this fight, you won't always know who your allies are and who's waiting to stab you in the back. I know. Do you? Because there are going to be good Marines you respect, who are going to be caught up in this. Marines who made bad decisions but aren't bad people. Marines who will lose everything because they trusted the wrong system or followed the wrong leaders. And you're going to have to watch that happen and accept that it's necessary. He put his hand on my shoulder. Truth has a cost, Kate. Make sure you're willing to pay it. All of it. Not just the parts that feel righteous. I met his eyes. I already paid for 8 years of lies, Sergeant Major. I can afford the truth. He nodded slowly, then smiled for the first time that morning. Your father raised you right. Even if he screwed up that one signature, he raised you right. After Mac left, I stood alone in the conference room looking out the window at the training grounds below. Marines were running drills, practicing tactics, preparing for wars they might never fight or might fight tomorrow. None of them knew yet that their institution was about to be shaken to its foundations, that the comfortable assumptions about hierarchy and loyalty and who deserved recognition were about to be challenged in ways that would force every Marine to choose sides. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You've made a powerful enemy today. Watch your back. I stared at that message for a long moment, then deleted it. Threats were the language of people who'd already lost but didn't know it yet. Another message came through, this one from my father. Katie Mack told me what happened. I'm proud of you. Whatever comes next, whatever consequences fall on me, I'm proud. Love, Dad. I typed back quickly. Love you too, Dad. See you tomorrow when the commandant arrives. This is going to get bigger before it gets better. His response was immediate. Then we better be ready. Sullivans don't quit. I pocketed my phone and headed back to my office. I had a training program to build, a curriculum to finalize, and about 24 hours before the highest-ranking Marine in the world would arrive to determine whether the Corps was willing to burn down its old boys network to save its soul. The sun was setting over Camp Pendleton, painting the sky in shades of amber and red. In the distance, I could see the Pacific Ocean, vast and indifferent to human concerns about justice and truth and institutional reform. That indifference was oddly comforting. Whatever happened in the coming days, weeks, months, the ocean would still be there, still following tides that cared nothing for rank or gender or comfortable lies. Some things were bigger than the Marine Corps, bigger than any institution built by humans. And maybe that was the real lesson here. The institutions we build that are only as strong as the truth we're willing to tell about them. The moment we start protecting comfortable lies, we begin the slow process of institutional decay. I'd spent 8 years watching that decay from the inside. Now I was forcing the infection to the surface, where it could either be treated or kill the patient. Tomorrow the commandant would arrive and make his choice. And I'd finally learn whether the Marine Corps I believed in still existed or whether it had died years ago and just hadn't had the honesty to admit it. I walked to the window one last time, watching the sun sink below the Pacific horizon. Tomorrow, General Raymond Wallace would review 6 hours of footage that would either reform the Corps or tear it apart. He'd see 17 names of officers who'd built a system of lies. He'd decide whether truth mattered more than institutional comfort. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Camp Pendleton, 43 women were sleeping, unaware that their careers were about to be corrected. 17 officers were sleeping, unaware they had faced courts-martial. And across America, thousands of Marines who believed in honor and courage were sleeping, unaware their institution was about to be tested. My phone buzzed one last time. Mac's final text of the night: tomorrow changes everything. Get some rest, Captain. You've earned it. I typed back, see you at 0730, Sergeant Major. Then I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that when I woke, nothing would ever be the same. The truth was out now, and there was no putting it back. The V-22 Osprey touched down at Camp Pendleton at precisely 0730, its distinctive tilt-rotor whine cutting through the morning air like a judgment from above. General Raymond Wallace didn't believe in being late, And he especially didn't believe in giving people time to prepare comfortable narratives before he arrived to hear uncomfortable truths. I stood on the landing pad beside Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and Chief Warrant Officer Graham, all of us in service dress uniforms, because you don't meet the Commandant of the Marine Corps in utilities no matter how hot the California morning promises to be. My father stood slightly behind us, no longer entitled to the front rank, now that he wore civilian clothes but present, because Hayes had requested he attend the briefing. Wallace descended the ramp with the economy of movement that comes from 40 years of service. At 61, he carried himself like a man who'd earned every gray hair and every line on his weathered face. 3 Purple Hearts from the Gulf War and Iraq. 2 Silver Stars. A career built on leading from the front rather than managing from behind a desk. He was exactly the kind of Marine I joined the Corps hoping to become, which made what I was about to do either the fulfillment of that hope or its complete betrayal, depending on how the next few hours unfolded. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Wallace said, returning her salute with parade ground precision. I read your preliminary report on the flight out. Now I want to see the evidence with my own eyes and hear from the people involved directly. Yes, sir. We have a secure conference facility prepared. Good. Let's not waste time. 20 minutes later, we were assembled in the same conference room where yesterday's confessions had unfolded. Wallace sat at the head of the table, Hayes and Graham on either side. My father and I sat across from them, and Sarah MacArthur sat at the far end with Mac beside her. Wallace looked at each of us in turn, his gaze sharp and assessing. Before we begin, I want to establish something. I didn't fly out here to protect the institution's reputation. I flew out here to determine whether the institution deserves its reputation. There's a difference, and that difference matters. He turned to me. Captain Sullivan, Colonel Hayes tells me you have helmet cam footage that contradicts an official after-action report from 2016. Show me. For the second time in 2 days, I watched senior officers view 6 hours of footage that destroyed 8 years of carefully maintained lies. But where Brennan had watched with the horror of a man seeing his sins projected on a screen, Wallace watched with the cold, analytical focus of someone calculating costs and consequences. When the footage reached the part where Eric MacArthur died in my arms, Wallace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When it showed me defending 6 wounded Marines alone for 6 hours while Brennan organized a rescue from a safe distance, his hands flat on the table pressed down harder. When it ended, he sat in silence for a full minute before speaking. Captain Sullivan, I've watched a lot of combat footage in my career. Most of it shows Marines doing their jobs under impossible circumstances. Some of it shows Marines exceeding every possible expectation of what human beings are capable of under fire. He looked at me directly. What I just watched falls into the second category. What you did that day in Ramadi is the kind of action that should have resulted in a Medal of Honor nomination, not a single line in a report calling your contribution adequate. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. I have questions, and I need answers that don't make me comfortable. I need answers that are true. First question, why did you wait 8 years to come forward? I'd prepared for this, had rehearsed the answer in my mind 100 times. But sitting across from the commandant, I realized that rehearsed answers were just another kind of lie. So I told him the truth. Because I was afraid, sir. Afraid that challenging a field-grade officer would end my career before it started. Afraid that the Marine Corps would choose to protect a major over a lieutenant. Afraid that telling the truth would mark me as a troublemaker, and I'd spend the rest of my service fighting institutional resistance instead of enemy combatants. Wallace nodded slowly. Those are all legitimate fears. They're also an indictment of the culture we've built. The fact that a Marine with your record felt she couldn't report misconduct without destroying her career tells me we have a systemic problem, not just a few bad actors. He turned to Hayes. Colonel, your preliminary report mentioned 17 officers involved in a network systematically disadvantaging female Marines. Give me the scope. Hayes pulled up a chart on her tablet and projected it onto the conference room screen. Sir, based on Colonel Brennan's testimony and the documents provided by his wife, we've identified patterns of coordinated evaluation manipulation spanning 8 years, 6 installations in multiple occupational specialties. The network includes 3 general officers, 7 colonels, and 7 lieutenant colonels, currently serving in key positions at HQMC and major commands. Wallace's expression darkened. Names. Hayes pulled up a list. I watched Wallace's face as he read through it, saw recognition and something like betrayal flicker across his features. These weren't strangers. These were Marines he'd served with, promoted, trusted. Christ, he muttered, half the manpower community. Graham spoke up. General, we've also identified 43 female Marines whose fitness reports were systematically lowballed using the techniques documented in Brennan's files. 12 had their combat contributions minimized in after-action reports. 7 left the service prematurely, citing hostile command climate. Show me the methodology. For the next 30 minutes, Hayes walked Wallace through the specific techniques the network had used. The emphasis on physical fitness metrics that statistically favored males. The subjective evaluations of leadership presence that somehow always rated women lower. The careful documentation of minor mistakes by female Marines, while similar mistakes by males went unrecorded. The systematic understatement of female contributions in combat operations. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, all carefully designed to appear objective, while systematically disadvantaging women. Wallace listened without interruption until Hayes finished. This isn't bias, he said finally. Bias is unconscious. This is deliberate discrimination with documented methodology and coordinated implementation. This is a conspiracy. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. Captain Sullivan, come here. I joined him at the window. Below us, Marines were running through combat drills. Young men and women training together, preparing to serve together, trusting that the institution would evaluate them fairly. You see those Marines? Wallace asked. Yes, sir. They believe in something. They believe that the Marine Corps is built on honor, courage, and commitment. They believe that excellence is recognized regardless of who demonstrates it. They believe that if they do their jobs with integrity and skill, the institution will take care of them. He turned to face me. You're about to force me to tell them that belief is a lie. That for years, maybe decades, we've been lying to female Marines about what it takes to succeed. That we've been systematically punishing excellence when it came in a form that challenged our comfortable assumptions. With respect, sir, I'm not forcing you to tell them anything. The institution forced this by building a system that protects liars. I'm just refusing to keep those lies hidden anymore. Wallace studied my face for a long moment. You're right, and that's exactly why this is so hard. You shouldn't have had to be the one to force this reckoning. The system should have corrected itself. The fact that it didn't, that it took a captain with helmet cam footage and 8 years of buried anger to expose this is the real failure. He returned to his seat. Here's what's going to happen. I'm authorizing a full Inspector General investigation across all Marine Corps commands. Every officer in Brennan's network will be investigated. Every fitness report they wrote for female Marines over the past decade will be reviewed. Every after-action report they filed will be cross-referenced against available evidence. Hayes made notes rapidly. The 43 female Marines who were systematically disadvantaged will have their records corrected and will be offered retroactive promotion boards. We'll establish an independent review board for equal opportunity complaints that bypasses the chain of command, and will implement mandatory training on evaluation bias for all officers at the 04 level and above. He paused. We'll also be expanding Captain Sullivan's combat training program from pilot status to service standard, with immediate funding for implementation at 3 additional installations. I felt something shift in my chest. Not triumph, something quieter and more complicated. Recognition, maybe, or validation. The knowledge that 8 years of fighting hadn't been for nothing. Sir, my father spoke for the first time. I need to address my role in this. Wallace turned to him. Sergeant Major Sullivan, I understand you signed off on the Ramadi after-action report without adequate verification. Yes, sir. I trusted Major Brennan's account because he was the ground commander, and I wasn't present for the operation. That trust was misplaced, and my failure to verify independently allowed his lies to become official record. Why didn't you question the discrepancies when Sergeant Major MacArthur raised concerns? My father's face tightened. Because I chose institutional loyalty over truth, sir. I convinced myself that MacArthur's grief over his son's death was clouding his judgment. I told myself that challenging a field-grade officer's report without absolute proof would damage unit cohesion. I was wrong on every count. Wallace nodded slowly. Sergeant Major, you're retired, so you're outside the UCMJ's reach. But I want your testimony in this investigation. I want you to explain to every senior enlisted advisor in the Marine Corps how you failed so they understand the consequences of choosing comfort over truth. Yes, sir, whatever you need. I also want you to work with Mrs. Brennan's Veterans Advocacy Organization. You'll have credibility with the old guard because you're one of them. Use that credibility to push for cultural change. My father straightened slightly, something like relief crossing his face. Not redemption exactly, but purpose. A way to make his failure mean something beyond just personal shame. Wallace turned to Sarah MacArthur. Mrs. MacArthur, your husband died 8 years ago protecting Marines he loved. For 8 years, his sacrifice was buried under lies. I can't give you back those 8 years, and I can't bring your husband back. But I can promise you that his death will be remembered truthfully, and his son will grow up knowing exactly what kind of Marine his father was. Sarah's voice was steady despite the tears on her face. General, I don't want promises. I want to see the officers who dishonored my husband held accountable. I want to see the system that enabled them reformed. And I want my son to serve in a Marine Corps that actually lives up to the values it claims to represent. You'll get all three. You have my word. Wallace checked his watch. I need to brief the Secretary of the Navy in 4 hours. After that, this investigation goes public. Captain Sullivan, within 48 hours, you're going to be the most famous Marine in America. Advocates will call you a hero. Opponents will call you a troublemaker who's destroying unit cohesion. The media will dissect every decision you have ever made. He leaned forward. I need to know right now, can you handle that? Because once this becomes public, there's no taking it back. Your life as a private citizen is over. You'll be a symbol whether you want to be or not. I thought about Eric MacArthur, about the promise I'd made to him, about the 43 women whose careers had been damaged by lies, about all the female Marines who'd come after me and would face the same systemic bias unless something fundamentally changed. I can handle it, sir. Good, because I'm also ordering you to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. They've been looking for an excuse to hold hearings on military integration, and you just gave them the perfect case study. My stomach dropped. Senate testimony, public record. Every word scrutinized by politicians looking for sound bites and opposing advocates looking for ammunition. When, sir, 30 days, Colonel Hayes will help you prepare, but understand that defense attorneys and political opponents are going to attack your credibility with everything they have. They'll question your motives, your service record, your judgment. They'll try to paint you as a disgruntled officer with a grudge. Let them try, sir. The helmet cam footage speaks for itself. Wallace smiled grimly. That's what I needed to hear. The briefing continued for another 2 hours. Details about investigation timelines, coordination with the Department of Defense, Inspector General Media Strategy, witness protection protocols. The machinery of institutional accountability grinding into motion, slow and inexorable. When it finally ended, Wallace stood. Captain Sullivan, walk with me. We left the conference room and headed toward the training grounds. The morning heat was building, promising another day of temperatures that would test human endurance. But I'd been tested by worse. I want to show you something, Wallace said. We walked to the edge of the hand-to-hand combat demonstration area where 2 days ago Brennan had ordered me struck down, where everything had started. This spot right here, Wallace said, this is going to be remembered. 20 years from now, young Marines will be told the story of what happened here. About the captain who was ordered struck down and took 3 seconds to change everything. He paused. The question is, what story will they be told? Will it be a story about one bad commander who got caught, or will it be a story about an institution that had the courage to confront its failures and reform itself? That depends on what happens next, sir. Exactly, which is why I'm giving you a direct order. Make your training program succeed. Not just technically succeed, but culturally succeed. Train Marines so effectively that gender becomes irrelevant. Prove that excellence is excellence, regardless of who demonstrates it. Yes, sir. And Captain, when the attacks come, when the death threats and hate mail pile up, when officers you respect tell you you're destroying the Corps, remember this? You're not destroying anything. You're burning away the rot so something better can grow. 30 days later, I sat before the Senate Armed Services Committee in a hearing room packed with reporters, advocates, and Marines in dress uniforms. The senators sat elevated above me, 20 pairs of eyes, representing everything from genuine concern to political calculation to barely concealed skepticism. Senator Patricia Warren, a Navy veteran from Massachusetts, chaired the committee. At 68, she'd spent 4 decades fighting for women's rights in military service. This hearing was in many ways the culmination of her career. "Captain Sullivan," she began, "thank you for your willingness to testify today about systemic gender discrimination in the United States Marine Corps. I know this hasn't been an easy decision." "Thank you, Senator. Let me start with a simple question. Why did you come forward?" I'd spent 30 days preparing for this moment. Hayes had drilled me on likely questions on how to frame answers for maximum impact, on staying calm under hostile cross-examination. But sitting in that chair, I realized that preparation was just another form of performance. So I told him the truth. "Senator, I joined the Marine Corps because my father taught me it stood for something greater than individuals. Honor, courage, commitment. When I discovered those words had become empty slogans protecting a culture of lies, I had 2 choices: protect the law or honor the truth. I chose truth because that's what Marines do. We accomplish the mission regardless of personal cost." Senator James Crawford, a 72-year-old Army veteran from Texas, leaned forward. He'd been publicly skeptical about women in combat roles, and his presence on the committee was a deliberate challenge. "Captain, some would say you're a disgruntled officer using gender politics to settle personal scores. How do you respond to that?" I met his eyes directly. "Senator, with respect, I have 143 confirmed combat kills across 4 deployments. I've been shot, blown up, and spent 6 hours defending wounded Marines solo against overwhelming enemy forces. I don't need gender politics to validate my service. What I need is a Marine Corps that documents that service honestly." Crawford's expression shifted slightly. "The committee has reviewed your helmet cam footage from Ramadi. I'll admit, Captain, it changed my perspective on a lot of things. Sir, what you did that day is what every American hopes our service members would do when faced with impossible choices. The fact that it was buried in official reports for 8 years is frankly a stain on the Marine Corps." He paused. "You have my full support for the reforms General Wallace has proposed." I felt something release in my chest. If Crawford the skeptic, the traditionalist, could be convinced by evidence, then maybe institutional change was actually possible. For 3 hours, I answered questions about Ramadi, about the network of officers who'd systematically disadvantaged women, about the 43 Marines whose careers had been damaged, about what reforms were necessary to prevent this from happening again. Then Senator Warren asked the question I'd been dreading. "Captain Sullivan, Lieutenant Eric MacArthur's widow and son are here today. Would you like to say anything to them?" I looked across the hearing room and found Sarah in the gallery. Eric Jr. sat beside her, 8 years old and wearing a miniature dress blue uniform that made him look heartbreakingly like his father. "Mrs. MacArthur," I said, and my voice carried across the suddenly silent room, "your husband was the bravest Marine I served with. His last thoughts were of you and your son. He made me promise to tell his father that I was the real deal. I hope I've honored that promise." I looked at Eric Jr. "Your father died protecting Marines he loved. For 8 years, his sacrifice was buried under lies. Today, we've told the truth. Your father died with honor. He died making sure other Marines could live. And he done it knowing that someone would stay behind to make sure his story was told correctly." Sarah stood and saluted me. The gesture was technically improper, a civilian saluting a service member in a congressional hearing, but nobody corrected her. Some moments transcend protocol. "Thank you, Captain," she said. "Eric always said you were the finest Marine he knew. Today you proved him right." The hearing concluded shortly after. Hayes met me outside the chamber looking simultaneously exhausted and satisfied. "You did well in there, Captain." "Better than well. Crawford's endorsement changes everything. If the old guard is willing to accept reform, we might actually pull this off." "What's next?" "Next we implement. Your training program launches in 2 weeks with your first full class. 40 Marines split evenly, male and female. The whole Marine Corps will be watching to see if you can deliver on everything you promised." 2 weeks later, I stood at the edge of the same training ground where this had all begun, watching 40 Marines file into formation. 20 males, 20 females, ages 19 to 32, infantry, artillery, combat engineers, all of them volunteers. All of them here because they'd heard about what happened and wanted to be part of something different. Corporal Emma Blake stood in the front row, the young woman who'd filed the first EO complaint. She'd been promoted and assigned as my assistant instructor. Beside her, Private Marcus Webb, 6'2" and fresh out of infantry training, watched with the intensity of someone ready to prove himself. Gunnery Sergeant Dylan Porter stood to my right now, Master Gunnery Sergeant and my senior instructor. The man I'd taken down in 3 seconds was now my closest collaborator. We'd spent 2 weeks developing curriculum, and I'd learned something important. Humility and skill aren't mutually exclusive. I looked at the 40 faces watching me and felt the weight of everything they represented. They were here because Eric MacArthur had died protecting his team, because Rebecca Brennan had chosen truth over marriage, because my father had admitted his failures, because Mac had kept a memo for 8 years waiting for someone brave enough to use it. They were here because 17 officers were facing courts-martial, because 43 women were getting their records corrected, because General Wallace had chosen institutional integrity over institutional comfort. "I'm Major Kate Sullivan," I began. "I've killed 143 enemy combatants. I've been shot twice, blown up once, and spent 6 hours alone defending wounded Marines against overwhelming enemy forces. I'm not here because I'm a woman. I'm here because I'm good at my job, and my job is making you good at yours." I paused, scanning their faces. This program exists because a Marine named Eric MacArthur stayed behind to protect his team, and because the truth about his sacrifice was buried for 8 years. We train here in his memory. Every technique I teach you, every principle I drill into you, serves one purpose: bringing you home alive to people who love you. Private Webb raised his hand. "Ma'am, permission to speak." "Granted." "Ma'am, I saw the helmet cam footage from Ramadi. Everyone has. I just want you to know that I was wrong to question whether you could teach me. I'm here to learn whatever you're willing to teach." I nodded. "Webb, before we're done, you're going to learn that size is an advantage until someone who understands leverage decides to make it a disadvantage. Step on the mat." He did. And for the second time, I showed a skeptic that physics and technique beat mass and strength. But this time, instead of humiliation, it was education. Instead of proving a point, it was teaching a lesson. Webb tapped out after 4 seconds, then immediately asked, "Can you teach me that?" "That's why you're here." For 12 weeks, I pushed those 40 Marines harder than most of them had ever been pushed. We drilled leverage mechanics until smaller fighters could control larger opponents. We practiced situational awareness until threats were identified before they materialized into violence. We ran endless repetitions of entry procedures and rapid decision-making under stress. But more importantly, I demonstrated every technique myself before requiring them to attempt it. When male Marines struggled with movements that required flexibility over strength, I showed them modifications. When female Marines doubted their ability to control larger opponents, I paired them with the biggest Marines in the class and walked them through the specific mechanics that made size advantages irrelevant. By week 4, the skeptics had become converts. By week 8, the class functioned as a cohesive unit where gender distinctions had become operationally meaningless. By week 12, every Marine could demonstrate proficiency in techniques they'd carry into future deployments. On graduation day, evaluation teams from HQMC watched 40 Marines demonstrate advanced combat skills. Senator Warren attended, General Wallace attended, Sarah MacArthur and Eric Jr. attended, sitting with Mac in the front row. The final demonstration featured Corporal Blake controlling 2 male Marines who outweighed her by 60 pounds each. She won in 47 seconds using pure technique. The male Marines who'd just been taken down by a woman 60 pounds lighter cheered her success equally with everyone else. That's when I knew we'd succeeded. Not because a woman had beaten men, but because trained Marines had proven that excellence has no gender. Wallace approached me after the ceremony. "Major Sullivan, I'm authorizing immediate expansion to 6 additional installations. Your curriculum becomes the service standard for close quarters combat training across the Marine Corps." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. You earned this. Now the hard part begins sustaining it. Making sure that what you've built here doesn't become just another program that gets watered down or abandoned when people aren't watching. It won't, sir, because it's not my program. It's Eric MacArthur's program and 43 other Marines whose service was buried. It belongs to every woman who came before me and fought battles I'll never know about. I'm just the one who happened to have a helmet cam in 8 years of anger. 6 months after that day on the training ground when Brennan ordered me struck down, I stood at Arlington National Cemetery beside Eric MacArthur's grave. Max, Sarah, and Eric Jr. stood with me. My father was there too, along with Rebecca Brennan, who'd become an unlikely ally in the fight for military accountability. I placed my silver star at the base of Eric's headstone. "This belongs to you," I said quietly. "You held that position so I could get everyone to safety. You were the hero that day, not me." Mac put his hand on my shoulder, and "Kate, my son's last words were about you. He said you were the real deal. You've honored his memory by forcing the Marine Corps to honor truth. That's the legacy Eric wanted." Eric Jr., wearing his Little League Marines uniform, looked up at me. "Miss Kate, my mom says you saved my dad so he could talk to her before he went to heaven. Thank you for giving her those last words from him." I knelt down to his level. "Eric, your dad was the bravest Marine I knew. He taught me that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing your job even when you're terrified. You carry his name. Honor it by always telling truth even when lies are easier." We stood there for a long time, 6 people bound together by loss and truth, and the slow, painful process of making institutions live up to their stated values. Later, back at Camp Pendleton, I stood once more at the training ground where this had all begun. Construction was underway on a new facility, the MacArthur Advanced Combat Center, named for the Marine who died believing in something better than what existed. A new class was forming up. 50 Marines this time, the program already expanding beyond anyone's initial projections. Emma Blake was now a sergeant leading instruction. Marcus Webb was a corporal teaching the techniques that had once humiliated him. Dylan Porter had been promoted again and was designing curriculum for other installations. I looked at them, these Marines who'd learned that skill mattered more than size, that courage mattered more than conformity, that truth mattered more than comfortable lies. My father approached, walking with Mac. Both of them had found purpose in their failures, using their mistakes to teach younger Marines how to avoid them. "Katie," my father said, "I got the letter today. The Marine Corps is formally correcting my record to note the oversight failure in 2016. It'll be part of my permanent file." "Dad, I'm sorry." "Don't be, it's the truth. And truth is what we're fighting for, right?" He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. "I'm prouder of you today than I've ever been. Not because you're successful or decorated or famous, but because you chose truth when lies would have been easier." That's what being a Marine really means. The sun was setting over Camp Pendleton, painting the sky in shades of amber and red. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human concerns about justice and reform and institutional change. But we weren't indifferent. We'd forced a reckoning that had cost careers and marriages and comfortable assumptions about how things worked. We'd exposed rot that had been festering for decades. And we'd proven that institutions could change when enough people refused to accept their failures. The Marine Corps didn't change overnight. Systems never do. But we'd started the change. 43 women got corrected records. 17 corrupt officers faced accountability. Hundreds of Marines learned that excellence has no gender. And a young lieutenant who died in Ramadi finally got the recognition he'd earned. My father had taught me the Corps was built on honor, courage, and commitment. I'd spent 12 years learning those words were sometimes hollow, but I'd also learned they could be made real again. One honest report at a time, one truthful testimony at a time, one Marine trained to value skill over stereotype at a time. That was legacy, not the medals or the rank or the recognition, but the truth left behind, the changes forced. The system improved for people who'd come after and would never know my name. I looked at the new class of Marines preparing for their first day of training. They believed in something. They believed the Marine Corps would evaluate them, fairly recognize their excellence, honor their service. Because of what had happened here, that belief was a little more true than it had been 6 months ago. Not perfect, not complete, but better. And better was enough to start with. I stepped onto the training mat and 50 Marines came to attention. Welcome to MacArthur Combat Center, I said. Let's get to work. That night, I returned to my quarters and sent one final email to the Marine Corps archives, the helmet cam footage with a note for future Marines who might need proof that truth can change institutions. My phone buzzed. Max text, Eric would be proud. Rest easy, Marine. I typed back, thank you, Sergeant Major, for everything. Then I closed the laptop and slept without nightmares for the first time in 8 years. The truth was out. The reckoning was done. That was enough.